friends. Next we move on to the Baharuth Empire, which has effectively lost or rather outsourced its greatest strength, Fluda Paradane. I know the man has become half mean by now and must probably be half senile as well, and even before that he had already managed to extend his lifespan beyond 2 centuries, but again Fluda Paradane was even more than Jerknef, the Empire's single most important trump card throughout its history. Fluda Paradane grew up during the invasion of the so-called evil deities and the subsequent defensive war fought by the 13 heroes. He came from a small, otherwise insignificant village called Belmaus. But from the moment he witnessed a great magic caster demonstrating his own power in this very village as a little child, he was completely captivated by magic. That event left such a deep impression on him that he devoted his life entirely to study of magic, subordinating everything else to that very goal of his. Even though he was not one of the 13 heroes, and even though he was denied access to the equipment of the 8 Great Kings when he traveled to Eriantiu, Fluda had contact with regret. He not only mentioned her himself, but also expressed hope that he had since this many years surpassed her. Both of them also used the same imperfect immortality spell to halt their aging, and even though that spell gradually degrades, causing them to start to age again, it still had allowed Fluda to live for over 200 years by now. In other words, this man is older than every nation that he had served until now, although he and the first emperor did not get along. Likely, and again this is just pure speculation on my part, because the emperor was a war veteran, fighting the evil deities, in other words fighting magical beings, and he was more likely focused on the military with its more physical fighting force and immediate necessities such as food, armament and territorial defense when founding the very empire that Fluda came to serve. And Fluda's magical education therefore, even with his gift of finding magical talented individuals, would take years before it yielded results. Nevertheless, he accumulated enough magical power and reputation that the emperor simply could not do without him, and therefore he became the court magician. And therefore, in the long run, an excellent education system and a prestigious magical academy emerged, and thanks to this, the empire was increasingly able to draw upon powerful casters, not only to integrate them into the army, but also to form specialized magical units. Thus, alongside hippogriff riders and an aerial force, there were also magical troops who, especially under Fluda's command, could eliminate enormous threats on their very own. Fluda and his students, for instance, managed to defeat and capture a Death Knight, a level 35 monstrosity. Moreover, thanks to the Magical Academy, the Empire enjoyed a greater supply of magical items, weapon and armor, as well as various artifacts that made everyday life so much easier for those who could afford them. Fluda did not only serve as a court magician, but also as a tutor, teacher and mentor to successive generations of emperors. And this is easily the biggest impact he had on the Empire of Baharuth, because in other words, he passed down knowledge from one generation to the next, ensuring that every single emperor was at the very least competent, and a truly gifted child like Jerknef was, through Fluda's influence, shaped from a rough diamond into a crown jewel of statecraft. It was not just Fluda's power, but also his stability and the education and structure he built around his immense magical ability that made him the greatest treasure of the empire, until he ultimately defected to the Sorcerer Kingdom, because Einsulgon, the Sorcerer King, could offer him more in terms of magical education and perhaps truly eternal life in death, as an undead elder lich. But fundamentally, Jerknef exchanged Fluda for the power and protection of a far greater being, the Sorcerer King himself. So it all worked out in the end. However, and this also must be emphasized, that even without Einsulgon's appearance, an undead revolution in the workforce would likely have occurred eventually gradually and in small numbers, as political and religious circumstances would have permitted just the slightest hints of them, at least initially, until they could reap the benefits of them. Undead laborers would have been introduced bit by bit, and working like robots or machines. They would also have increased the per capita productivity, especially in mines and on the farmlands, thereby freeing up additional manpower for the army and the economy, even though the implementation of all of this would have met massive resistance from everyday citizens, from the temples, and from just everybody else who would stand to lose if work and labor became cheap and easily available. But again, the mere fact that Fluda Paradane could have implemented a greatly weakened version of Ein Solgorn's undead labor force stands testament to his power and his importance for the Empire of Baharuth.